Ladies and gentlemen, if you were to overhear two people quarreling, say over whose turn it was to wash the dishes, you'd likely hear phrases like, "That's not fair," or "You promised." These aren't just emotional outbursts. They reveal something quietly astonishing. Both people believe in a shared standard of right and wrong, even if they disagree on how it applies. Now ask yourself, where did that idea of fairness come from? It's certainly not a law of nature like gravity. If you ignore gravity, you fall. But if you ignore justice, you don't fall. You become unjust. And yet we care deeply. The law of human nature is not a law in the sense of gravity or thermodynamics. It is not a force that simply acts upon us without our choice. Rather, it is a standard of behavior which we all expect others to follow, and we expect ourselves to follow it too, even when we fail to do so. This law is unique in that it does not describe what people actually do in every moment, but rather what they ought to do. And that word "ought" is essential. When someone cuts in line or breaks a promise, we don't just notice their action, we feel that something wrong has happened. There is a built-in expectation of fair treatment, honesty, courage, kindness. And interestingly, when people act badly, they almost always try to excuse or justify themselves. They don't say, "Yes, I did wrong and I don't care." They say, "I had to do it because," or "You don't understand the full story." This universal instinct to justify shows that they still believe in the standard. They just hope they're not guilty of breaking it. If there were no such moral standard, arguments about fairness or right and wrong would make no sense. You can't say something is crooked unless you have an idea of what straight is. In the same way, we can't call something unjust unless we have some notion of justice, even if we never fully live up to it. Cultures may vary in the details. Some societies bury their dead, others burn them, but the underlying values show remarkable consistency across time and geography. In every human society, things like bravery, fidelity, truthfulness, and fairness are admired. Things like betrayal, cowardice, and cruelty are condemned. Even when these values are twisted, their existence is still acknowledged. A thief, for example, may operate by stealing from others, but he would be outraged if someone stole from him. This reveals that deep inside, the same standard applies. The law of human nature is not a matter of personal preference or societal convenience. It's not like deciding between vanilla or chocolate, or whether to drive on the left side of the road or the right. It's more like mathematics or logic, something that feels unchangeable, something we discover rather than invent. You might say that different societies create their own moral codes, but you'll find that when they do, they're not starting from zero. They're usually refining or applying a standard they already acknowledge. Even revolutionaries who seek to overthrow corrupt systems appeal to a deeper justice to make their case. They don't just say, "I don't like this," they say, "This is wrong, and it ought to be changed." That little word "ought" tells us everything. This law is not about self-interest either. It often calls us to do things that cost us something, to speak the truth when a lie would be safer, to help someone when it is inconvenient, to forgive when we'd rather hold a grudge. If the moral law were only about maximizing pleasure or survival, it would make little sense for people to act in ways that put them at risk for the sake of others. And yet we do. Soldiers throw themselves on grenades to save their comrades. Strangers jump into rivers to save drowning children. These acts may be rare, but the very fact that we honor them shows how deeply we value the principle behind them. What's even more intriguing is how universal the awareness of this law is. Even children appeal to fairness instinctively, long before they learn philosophy or religion. "That's not fair," they shout, before they can fully explain why. This suggests the law is not something taught, but something known, something embedded in the human condition. There's a common belief that what we call the moral law is simply another one of our natural instincts, like hunger, fear, or the desire to protect our offspring. According to this view, when we act kindly or bravely, we're simply obeying one instinct that evolution has favored in certain situations. But when we look closely, we can see that the moral law is quite different from instinct, and in fact, it often appears to judge and direct our instincts, rather than being one itself. Take a situation in which you hear someone calling for help from a dangerous place, perhaps a drowning person, or someone trapped in a burning house. In that moment, you might feel two competing instincts. One says, "Run to help them," the instinct for altruism, sympathy, or herd protection. The other says, "Stay safe, don't put yourself in danger," the instinct for self-preservation. Now, if the moral law were just another instinct, we'd expect it to be felt like either of those two internal urges. But what we actually experience is quite different. We feel a third force, one that tells us which of the two instincts we ought to follow. It doesn't just say, you feel sympathy. It says, you should help, even if it's risky. And if we choose to run away and ignore the cry for help, we don't merely feel regret, we feel guilt, which suggests we've violated something deeper than instinct. This third voice, this moral pressure, doesn't behave like an instinct. It behaves more like a judge or referee, someone standing outside the game, telling the players which move is fair or foul. It encourages one instinct in one situation and suppresses another in a different situation. It may tell us to run toward danger when someone needs saving, but in another moment, it might tell us to resist the urge to lash out in anger, even if that anger is deeply instinctive. The point is, this moral guidance is not simply one urge competing with another, it's the standard that evaluates all the urges. Now imagine you're trying to decide between playing music and studying for an exam. Your instinct for pleasure says, go play music. Your sense of duty says, you ought to study. The voice that tells you which to choose isn't identical with either instinct. It belongs to something else entirely. It is that something else that we call the moral law. It doesn't create desires, it judges them. Some argue that perhaps the moral law is just the stronger instinct winning out. But this doesn't match our experience. Often, the right thing is not what we most strongly desire. The instinct to help someone may be very weak, and the desire to avoid trouble very strong. But we still feel that we should help. The moral law frequently tells us to obey the weaker impulse when it is the more noble one. In that sense, it actually runs counter to the instinctive explanation. If all morality were instinct, then we would never be able to question it. We would simply act on whichever urge was dominant, and morality would reduce to whichever instinct wins. But the moment we evaluate our instincts, when we say, I felt like yelling but I knew it was wrong, we're proving that we believe there's a standard that sits above the instincts and passes judgment on them. We aren't just bundles of drives, we are beings who can stand back and consider whether a drive is right or wrong. One might also point to the idea of a herd instinct, the claim that humans have developed an instinct to protect and care for others in the group. While this may be true biologically, it still doesn't explain why we feel morally compelled to care even for strangers or enemies, which often goes against both biological self-interest and group preservation. If we help someone not because it benefits our group or ourselves, but because it feels right, then we are following a command that is not dictated by natural selection or survival instincts. In other words, we are obeying the moral law, not the herd instinct. When we look at the moral standards held by people across different times and cultures, it's tempting to think that these values were simply invented, like laws passed by a government, or rules created for a game. But a closer look reveals something much deeper. The moral law, or the standard by which we judge right and wrong, does not behave like an invention. It acts more like a discovery, something found, not made. Just as we discover mathematical truths or physical laws rather than creating them, we seem to uncover moral truths that we feel obligated to follow, even when they are inconvenient or go against our desires. One of the strongest arguments for this is the remarkable consistency of certain moral principles across time and geography. Cultures may differ in how they express values, but not in whether the values exist. For example, all societies value honesty, courage, kindness, and justice in some form. No culture celebrates betrayal, cowardice, or cruelty as virtues. There may be exceptions in behavior, but not in principle. When societies differ in moral practices, it's usually a question of misunderstanding facts or applying shared values differently, not of denying the values themselves. Take the example of human sacrifice in ancient cultures. Such societies may have believed it was necessary to appease the gods, but they did not reject the moral principle of showing respect or giving honor. They simply had a mistaken idea of how to fulfill that principle. In this way, the differences actually underline the deeper similarities. If morality were invented, like traffic laws or fashion trends, it would be just as easy to change. We could say lying is acceptable now, or it's okay to abandon our sick and elderly. But we don't treat morality this way. When someone commits a serious wrong, we don't just say that's out of style. We say that's unjust, or that's evil. Even people who argue that morality is relative often speak as if their own beliefs are objectively right when something offends their sense of justice. This contradiction reveals that most people, deep down, do not really believe morality is a human invention. They might claim so intellectually, but they live and feel as if moral laws are real, fixed, and above personal or cultural preference. Think about the way we appeal to morality in conversation. When someone says, "You shouldn't have done that," they're not merely expressing a personal dislike, they're appealing to a standard they expect the other person to recognize. If morality were just a product of individual preference or social convention, there would be no reason to argue at all. We don't argue over which flavor of ice cream is correct, because preferences don't require justification, but we do argue about justice, fairness, and right conduct.
because we believe, sometimes passionately, that there is a correct answer, even if it's difficult to discover. Another clue that moral law is not invented is how we experience guilt. We don't merely feel disappointed with ourselves when we do something wrong. We feel that we have failed to meet a standard that we ought to have kept. Guilt is not just the discomfort of having made a poor choice. It is the recognition of having violated something objective, something bigger than us. And this guilt often comes uninvited, even when no one else knows what we've done. If morality were just a social invention, it would make little sense to feel guilty when no one is watching. Children also show signs that they are not merely absorbing moral rules from the outside, but are wired to recognize them from the beginning. They cry out, "That's not fair," before they've studied any moral philosophy or been fully taught social rules. They intuitively grasp the idea of justice long before they can articulate it. That doesn't prove they understand every nuance, but it suggests they are responding to something already present in human nature. The way we speak, the way we argue, and the way we feel all point to the idea that morality is not something we made up to keep order in society. Rather, it is something we discover, a reality that imposes itself upon us. And because it stands above our instincts, preferences, and cultural customs, it demands that we treat it not as a human invention, but as a truth to which we are accountable. It's one thing to talk about a moral law that all people seem to know in some basic way, but what really brings the weight of that law home is the undeniable fact that none of us truly live by it. Not completely, not consistently. We break the very standard we admit exists, and more tellingly, we know that we do. This is not the failure of a few especially immoral individuals. It is a universal condition. Every human being falls short of the moral standard they accept, and in fact, the more honestly we examine ourselves, the more clearly we see it. Take, for example, the way people behave in everyday life. We expect fairness from others, but we don't always practice it ourselves. We want to be treated with patience, but we lose our temper with astonishing ease. We want others to be truthful, but we exaggerate, hide the truth, or twist facts when it benefits us. We hold others to standards we often excuse ourselves from. A person may complain that someone else is rude or inconsiderate, and yet not notice the same behavior in themselves. What makes this interesting is that we still believe in the standard, even while violating it. We don't throw out the rule, we just hope it doesn't apply too strictly to us in that moment. Even more revealing is our constant need to justify ourselves. If we truly didn't believe in right and wrong, there would be no need to make excuses. But we do. When we fail to help a friend, when we lie on a form, when we say something cruel, we almost always follow it up with the defense, "I was tired. They deserved it. It wasn't really a lie." This instinct to cover up or explain our behavior is not something we do for others alone. We often do it internally, in the quiet court of our own conscience. We are our own judges, and we are rarely satisfied with the verdict. We defend ourselves because we know on some level that we've fallen short of a law we didn't invent, and can't easily escape. This tension between what we know we ought to do and what we actually do is something every person has experienced. And unlike other kinds of failure, this one is deeply personal. If we fail to hit a target in archery, or miss a note in a piano recital, we feel disappointed. But when we fail to be kind, generous, honest, or brave, we feel ashamed. That difference in emotional response tells us that moral failure is not just technical, it is about who we are as people. It strikes at our identity, because it reveals a gap between the kind of person we believe we should be, and the one we actually are. And this is where the moral law becomes not just a philosophical idea, but a mirror. It shows us something we often don't want to see. When we're honest, we begin to realize that the problem isn't out there in the world, it's within us. We are not simply people who make mistakes. We are people who knowingly choose what is wrong, who betray our own conscience, even when no one else is watching. This is not just the occasional slip-up, it is a recurring pattern, and it leaves us with a sense of moral debt. We also tend to shift the standard depending on our situation. We judge ourselves more gently, and others more harshly. We demand justice when we're the victim, but we ask for mercy when we are the offender. This inconsistency again proves that we're not unaware of the law. We're uncomfortably aware, and we often try to bend it in our favor. Yet even in our bending, we acknowledge the rule exists. If morality were purely subjective or relative, there would be no need for these mental gymnastics. But the very fact that we wrestle with guilt, shame, and justification shows that we're working against something real, something firm, something that holds whether we like it or not. When we take all that we've explored about the moral law, the way it is universally recognized, how it stands above instincts, how it cannot be explained by biology or culture alone, and how we all know it yet fall short of it, it leads us to a striking and unavoidable possibility that this moral law is not merely a feature of human psychology or evolution, but rather a clue to something much deeper, It points to a mind behind the universe, a reality not just of matter and energy, but of intelligence, intention, and moral awareness. In other words, the moral law suggests that behind the physical world there is a moral source, someone, not just something. Think about it. When we speak of laws in the natural sciences, gravity, motion, thermodynamics, those are descriptions of what things do by necessity. An apple falls from a tree because gravity acts upon it. The laws don't care about right or wrong, they just describe how things behave. But the moral law is fundamentally different. It tells us what we ought to do, and this sense of ought cannot be reduced to descriptions of behavior or survival advantage. No one says, you ought not to break the law of gravity because you can't. But we can break the moral law, and we do. That very ability to obey or disobey it shows that it is not a natural law in the scientific sense, but a command or a guide that appeals to our freedom and responsibility. Now, where does a law like that come from? If it were merely a product of evolution or societal agreement, it would have no authority beyond convenience. But we experience the moral law as something with real authority. It doesn't just tell us what is useful or socially acceptable. It binds us even when disobedience would benefit us. It holds us accountable even in secret. It speaks to us when no one else is watching. That voice of conscience, the one that says you ought, carries the weight of something beyond ourselves, something that has the right to command and the power to judge. And that suggests we are not just creatures living in a material universe, but moral beings in a universe with moral structure. But moral structure requires a source. Laws do not exist without lawgivers. If there is a law, particularly one that governs not physical behavior but moral conduct, it makes sense to assume there is a moral mind behind it, not a force or a principle, but a being, because only a personal mind can issue commands, create moral obligation, and be concerned with justice. Forces like magnetism or electricity don't care about good and evil. Evolution doesn't know right from wrong, but the moral law does. And if it exists, it implies that the origin of the universe is not indifferent to human behavior, but deeply involved in it. This moral dimension of reality also suggests something personal about the universe. If the ultimate source of the moral law were impersonal, like gravity or mathematics, then we could no more disobey it than we could stop aging or fall upwards. But we can choose to ignore the moral law, which means it appeals to our reason and will. It is persuasive, not coercive. This is the way a mind works, not a blind force. We are not being programmed by it like machines. We are being guided by it like children by a parent, or subjects by a ruler. And this guidance, so often ignored yet ever present, hints at a presence far greater than any human invention. We might try to explain away the moral law as wishful thinking, or as the result of conditioning, but those explanations fail to account for the universality and authority of the law itself. We feel the pressure of morality, even when it works against our own interest, even when no one is watching, even when it costs us dearly. We feel it because it is real, and if it is real, then it is more than just a human experience. It is a message, a signal, a whisper from something or someone beyond the material world. So far, we've been talking about something that is undeniably real to almost everyone, the sense of right and wrong, the inner moral law that speaks to us like a quiet but firm voice. We've explored how this moral law cannot be reduced to instinct, cultural conditioning, or mere evolutionary convenience. We've seen that it behaves more like a command than a suggestion, and that it points to a higher mind, a moral being behind the universe. But for all this, we must be careful not to make a premature leap. Recognizing a moral law, and even accepting the existence of a moral lawgiver, does not yet bring us into the heart of what Christianity claims. This is not yet Christianity, it is only the groundwork. At this stage, all we have is a general sense of a spiritual reality. We have a clue that something, or rather someone, is behind the universe. Someone who cares about right and wrong, someone whose nature is reflected in the standard we all know, and yet fail to live up to. That's a powerful and significant realization. It means the universe is not merely an accident, not merely particles and physics, but shaped by meaning, order, and moral truth. But still, this being remains unnamed, unexplained, and distant. We are not yet talking about a personal relationship with God, not yet talking about forgiveness, grace, or the life of Christ. We are only at the edge of the forest, not yet inside. It's worth pausing here to reflect on what we've uncovered, and what it tells us, not just about the universe, but about ourselves. If there is a moral law, and if that law comes from a mind behind the universe, then it follows that this mind is deeply concerned with human behavior. And since we all fall short of this moral law, since we all at some point break it willingly and knowingly, it means we are in a position of failure before this higher standard. This is an uncomfortable truth. It's one thing to feel guilty before our peers or disappointed in ourselves, but it's another thing entirely to imagine ourselves in the wrong before the very creator of moral order. Yet that is where the logic takes us. We are not just beings in a morally structured world, we are beings who have failed to live according to that structure. The moment we admit this, we also recognize our need for help, for correction, for restoration. We feel the weight of moral debt, and though we might try to bury it or excuse it, it remains with us. The discomfort we feel when we have done wrong, the nagging voice of conscience, and the persistent awareness that we fall short, all of this pushes us to seek something more. But so far, we have only realized the need. We have not yet discovered the answer. At this point, some people might feel tempted to turn back. The moment the conversation turns from, there is a right and wrong, to I have done wrong, the stakes become personal. It's easy to philosophize about values and ideals. It's harder to face our own moral failings. But if we stop here, we miss the most important part of the journey, because this isn't just about identifying a problem, it's about preparing us to recognize the solution when it appears. And that solution is not an idea, a rule, or a philosophy. It is a person, but again, we're not there yet. This stage, acknowledging the moral law, and our failure to keep it, places us in a serious but honest position. It removes illusions about human goodness, and invites humility. It shows that our situation is not just flawed or difficult, it is broken. But it also opens a door, because once we understand that we need help, once we understand that we are not self-sufficient, we are finally ready to listen for something more, something beyond reason and morality alone. We begin to wonder whether that moral lawgiver, the one whose standard we have failed, might also be the one who could restore us. But that as yet is not the argument. That is what lies ahead.